Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Vav. We're in the middle of a big tangent that we've gotten off on, so I'll just review a little bit about what we're up to. Try to do this briefly. We started at the top of Nun Hamad Bet with the drasha of Lo te'aseh chametz and Lo te'afeh chametz, and then we had explained that we learned from there, which is a topic we're going to get back to later in today's daf, which is that you're chayav for every single action you do, and that the Lo te'afeh builds the principle for all of them. It came out of the general to basically not teach only about itself, lo lamed al klal kulo yatsa, but lo lamed al atzmo el al klal kulo. It didn't come to teach just about afiyah, that you're only going to be liable afiyah on its own. No, every single action you do that causes leavening of the bread to happen, whether it's kneading, whether it's setting up the bread, whether it's putting the water on the top of the dough, whether it's baking it, you're going to have your own set of lashes. That was the whole drasha. The Gemara then said, why don't we say it's a klal prat, and then you only have the prat, which is first it starts with asiyah, general, then it goes to specific afiyah, and then they say because they're far apart from each other. We don't do klal and prat when they're far apart. Well, that led Rabbi Achiya to question and say, what are you talking about? We don't do klal and prat when they're far apart from each other. And he quotes this long braita with, I would say, 3 different sections about the pasuk of the Nasi, and now we're completely in this topic. The whole reason we brought it was to show, look, there's a klal prat even though they're far from each other. In the end, they reject that. They say, this is not a klal prat. There was a different reason why they thought. Okay, let's just go through very quickly what they thought. They took the seer of the Nasi that said we slaughter it in the north. It said we slaughter this in the same place we do the Ola. Then they said, but there's another pasuk that says we slaughter the chatat in the north. And then they say, you would have thought maybe. And this is where they thought they meant klal prat, and maybe it's only true for the seer of the Nasi. It's the only sin offering that's offered in the north. They brought a third pasuk that said, oh no, there's another pasuk that talks about slaughtering the chatat in the north. Therefore, even though you might have thought that it was just for that, it actually is for all the sin offerings. Now, what's bothering them is what you would have thought. So they thought that when they said, you would have thought that it was just specifically in the seer Nasi, that's because they were doing a klal prat, and here you see 2 psukim that are completely not near each other, and they thought to do a klal prat. In the end, they said that's not what it was. What they thought in the middle of that braita was that the word oto meant to say only this and not any other sacrifice. And that had nothing to do with a klal prat, and they proved it because they basically said it was actually the reverse order. It should have been prat klal, and that actually includes everything. So the fact that they thought it was exclusionary pasuk must come from the word oto. Now that's the big word that's going to bother us because, again, now we're going to reread the braita very briefly, and we're going to just review it. They said, okay, it says oto by the Nasi, and by the seer of the Nasi. But then it also says, let's skip oto right now. It says you slaughter it in the north. Then it says you slaughter general sin offerings in the north. But since the pasuk about the seer Nasi said oto, we would have thought maybe just that one and not any other, because oto means it, specifically this one. Comes a third pasuk to say, no, in fact, all of them. So then that leads the Gemara to question and say, then what does the word oto come to exclude? And that's what we're up to. So we're a complete tangent on a tangent because we're no longer in the klal prat topic. We're definitely no longer on the baking and kneading topic. We're on the topic of what is the word oto and the pasuk about the Nasi coming. And there's a very cute mnemonic, Nachshon shachat of b'tzafon. Okay, Nachshon slaughtered a bird on Pesach. Those are the 4 things. Seer Nachshon, which we did already. We'll go back to that now. We'll see slaughtering. We'll talk about what that means in a minute soon. Bird and Pesach. Okay, those are the 4 options that we're going to try to suggest. We're actually going to reject them all in the end, and then come back and reinstate one of the earlier ones. Okay, number 2. We'll see that later. So right now, we're up to suggesting that maybe the word oto in that pasuk about the seer of the Nasi, again, this is when the Nasi sins unwittingly, right, and then has to bring a unique sin offering. So that is coming to say that has to be in the north, but there goes our sirens. Okay. Noise. Let's see where our noises are. Okay, that was just a warning. We'll see if whether the siren goes off. Okay, so now we're going to have like this. Sorry, just collect my thoughts for a minute, what I was up to. Tov. So now what we're going to say is, this seir is in the north specifically. But that one-time seir that they brought when the Nasi'im, when they did the consecration of the tabernacle, the Nasi'im each brought a seir, that one doesn't need the north. Now, in order to establish that this is coming specifically to say this and not that, we have to understand that there was a reason to think that one specifically would be, that one would need north. Now, why would you think that? Well, comes the Gemara. Now, the obvious reason to think it is because it's a sin offering. Sin offerings all need north. We're going to come back to that option soon. But right now they say, it's because that sin offering needed smicha. There was a special drasha to say you need to do smicha, put your hands on it, just like in other sin offerings. So since it needed smicha, it would also need north. That's what we would think. The problem is that we saw, we ended our daf with this yesterday. I'm reading the end of Nun Hamud Bet. L'rabot seir nachshon l'smicha, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. But Rabbi Shimon omer l'rabot seir avodah zarah l'smicha. According to Rabbi Shimon, this has nothing to do with anything, because the samach yado rosh seir, this was a different pasuk, right? About the head of the seir needs smicha. Why specifically the seir? Well, it's either to say, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's a different seir that needs smicha also, which is the nachshon one. According to Rabbi Shimon, it has nothing to do with seir nachshon. It has to do with sirei avodah zarah. That if you unwittingly sin in avodah zarah, you have to bring a seir. That one needs smicha also. So matkif la Rabbi. So basically, the answer the Gemara gave was, Oto is coming to say this one not seir nachshon. Why would you have thought seir nachshon might need north? Because it needs smicha. Well, first of all, that's only going to work according to Rabbi Yehuda, not according to Rabbi Shimon. So that's the first question of the Gemara. Matkif la Ravina. First question of Ravina. Tinach li Rabbi Yehuda. So I get, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that Oto could be coming to say not seir nachshon because it needs smicha. You might have thought it needed north. Oto comes saying no, it doesn't need to be done in the north. But the Rabbi Shimon, but according to Rabbi Shimon, since smicha doesn't need smicha, why would you have thought it needed north? Amalei Marzutra Berei Rav Meri Ravina. He adds to Ravina and he says to him, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, I have a difficulty. The Rabbi Yehuda Nami, my it Rabbi, my lo it Rabbi. If there's a special drasha to say it needs smicha, that actually proves the point that it obviously doesn't need north, because it needs smicha, meaning there's a special drasha. Where there's a drasha to say it's like other korbanot chatat, there's a pasuk. Where there's no pasuk, there's no reason to think that. So why would you have even thought it need north? So now, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no reason to think it would need north, which means the word oto is not coming to exclude that. Now he does say, if you want to say, ilo ma'atikra, hava amina tete bebinyanav. Now you might have thought what I suggested originally, which is obvious. Well, maybe you would have thought we just learn it directly from chatat. Maybe you would just think it's a sin offering. All sin offerings need north, so this also needs north. So wouldn't you have thought that? Well, smicha gufa lishta kramine v'tete bebinyanav. You could have then, if you don't need a pasuk, if you would have thought it's obvious you're going to learn north from all other sin offerings, then you would say it's obvious you're going to learn smicha from all other sin offerings. So then you wouldn't need a pasuk for smicha. So basically, there's no reason to suggest that, you just might have thought it was obvious because it's a sin offering, it would need north, and that's why Oto comes to exclude it, because then it would have been obvious you would need smicha, and you don't. So they now conclude, so what's the reason why it needed to tell you specifically there was a drasha for smicha? Because we don't learn sha'ami dorot. We don't learn a one-off event, even though it was a sin offering. It's a one-off sin offering, but we're not going to learn from there, from that case, from future generations. So hachanami sha'ami dorot le'ofinan. Likewise, we're not going to say, it would have been obvious that there was north because it's a sin offering, because that was a unique one-time offering, and because of that, there's no reason to be concerned. Okay, it looks like the siren skipped our area, so we're in good shape this morning. Okay, so now the way it works is like this. We suggested, sorry, I'm a little distracted with all the things going on, but we'll try to stay focused. What we tried to say in a bunch of different, we went through a bunch of different options of trying to suggest that maybe you would have thought that you would need a pasuk to tell you the seir of nachshon doesn't need north, but in the end we're able to say no, that you don't need a pasuk for that. It's obvious. No one would have even thought to suggest it for all parts, right? All reasons, okay? Either Rabbi Shimon, because he doesn't even learn anything, smicha from there, or Rabbi Yehuda, if he learned smicha, well, he just learned smicha, obviously nothing else, and therefore there was no reason to think we would learn north. Or if you'd say, in general, maybe we learn everything from there, but we don't because it's got its own unique halacha. And the fact that smicha was specifically, there was a drasha, shows that we don't learn one from the other. Because otherwise, why would you need the drasha for smicha? So in the end, Oto can't be coming to limit and say, not this year of Nachshon, because there would be no reason to think this year of Nachshon would need north, that you would need a pasuk to say it doesn't. Okay, on to number 2. So Nachshon shachat, we're now up to shachat. So now we're going to talk, it's really shochet, okay, the person who slaughters. Ela Oto ta'un safon, vein hashochet omei b'tzafon. Maybe it's coming to teach you something we actually learned already in Zvachim, which is the animal needs to be in the north, but the slaughterer doesn't need to be in the north. Okay, when you slaughter the animal, we learned this, you could have a very long knife reaching in to the north area of the courtyard. You could be standing somewhere else. Okay, so they say, and maybe that's what it's saying. So now let's go back to the pasuk. V'shachat oto, b'mkom she'yishchat t'tawala, oto is the animal. You slaughter the animal. Okay, now that shows that, okay, now let's be clear, that means the animal needs to be there. Oto now becomes not the korban, not the sacrifice in general, that, do this in the north, but it's talking about the animal versus the person. The person doesn't have to be in the north. Okay, that's what a drasha actually is true. But what's the problem? Midi Rabbi Achiya nafka. But Rabbi Achiya learns that from somewhere else. So you don't need this pasuk to teach it because it's learned from a different pasuk. Detanya. It says in a braita, Rabbi Achiya omer, v'shachat oto al yerech hamizbeach tzafon. Now this is a different shachat oto. Don't get confused. It's the same language, but it's in the very beginning of Sefer Vayikra, and it's not talking about a sin offering, it's talking about a burnt offering. Now remember, all the sin offerings, it says, slaughter it where you slaughter the burnt offering. So whatever's going to be true for the burnt offering is going to be true for the sin offering. So it's already derived. This is Vayikra chapter 1, verse 11. V'shachat oto al yerech hamizbeach tzafon. Now, matamud lamar, why does it tell you? Slaughter it. What do you need the oto for? Lefi shematzinu b'mekabel, now, the one who collects the blood, again, every time you have a drasha, you have to prove an exclusionary one. You have to prove why would you have thought. Why would you have thought the slaughterer needs to be standing in the north? Because the one who accepts the blood, we know, has to stand in the north. Now, they don't tell you how we know that, but they take it as a given that when you collect the blood, you have to be standing in the north. It's not enough to just put your hand into the north and you could be standing somewhere else. Remember what we mean by north. We mean the northern half of the temple courtyard. Okay, it all has to be done in the temple courtyard, but kodshe kodshim have to be slaughtered in the north. Kodshim kalim, the lighter ones, okay, the kodshe kodshim are chatat, asham, and ola. There's also shalmei tzibur, which we've learned the shnei kivsei atzeret, but basically you have kodshe kodshim in the north. Everything else can be slaughtered anywhere in the temple courtyard. Now, comes the drasha and says like this: since the mikabel, the one who accepts the blood, has to be standing in the north, you might have thought, okay, if the person who accepts the blood is standing in the south, but is collecting the blood in the north, pasal, it's completely disqualified, that blood. You have to slaughter a new animal. Yachol af zekin, you might have thought also the slaughterer. Talmud Lamal, Oto. Now remember, this is not our Oto. This is the Oto in Aleph Yud Aleph, not in Dalid Kaf Dalid, which is our pasuk. So Oto b'tzafon v'lo shochet tzarich liot omei b'tzafon. So that can't be because we already learned that b'tzafon for the animal, but not the slaughterer. That's learned from a different pasuk. So our Oto, what do we do with it? Answer number 3. Nachshon shachat of. We're up of. Okay, so Ela oto b'tzafon ve'em ben of b'tzafon. Maybe it's teaching you that when we talk about kodshe kodshim, they have to be slaughtered in the north, we're talking only about animals and not about birds. Now this happens to be true also, but we're going to basically end up proving that there's no reason you would have thought that the bird needs to be in the north, that you need a pasuk to say it's not. Okay? Basically, there's no reason to think the bird would have to be slaughtered in the north. Now, they're first going to suggest why they think you would think that. You would need the pasuk to exclude it, and then they'll reject that. Meaning, again, it's obvious, it's just like Seir Nachshon. Why would you have thought it needed north? Just like this, why would you have thought it needed north? Just to comment, there's kind of 2 methods of rejecting. One is someone else learned it from somewhere else, Okay, it's true, but it's learned from somewhere else. The other option is it's true, but there'd be no reason you need a pasuk to tell you it's exclude. Of course it's that way. It's just intuitively obvious that it's that way, or there's no reason to have thought otherwise. The fourth one actually is going to be a bit of a combination of the two, but we'll see that soon. So now they say, so if you slaughter a bird, it doesn't need to be in the north, even though it's kachikachim, right? An ola or a chata, but it doesn't need north. Okay, now remember, you don't slaughter a bird. What do? You do malika. Remember that the Kohen takes his finger in the back of the neck of the bird, and that's how he kills it. It's not slaughtering. So now you might have thought, here we have to prove why we need a pasuk to exclude it. You might have thought by a kavachomer, if you do the animals in the north, all the more so should you do the birds in the north. Why? What would be the kavachomer? Right? Usually birds are less high level sanctity. Again, kochikalim, they're the same, but they're always a little bit less than the animals. But here they're going to suggest why we think it would be more strict than the animals. Salkadata chamina. You would have thought later b'kavachomer ben son, because ma ben son shelo kavalo kohen kavalo tzafon. Okay, now we're talking about slaughtering the bird versus slaughtering the animal. Slaughtering the animal, if you remember, slaughtering can be done by anyone. Not only a Kohen, could be a woman even, can do the slaughtering in the temple. So, a ben son, you don't even need a Kohen to do it, and yet it needs north. So there's some stringency about a bird, because a bird, the malika, is only done by a Kohen. So ben of shekavalo Kohen, where you have to do it by a Kohen, by a bird, eino din shenikbalo tzafon. So you would think those things go hand in hand. If it needs a Kohen, it must need north. And that's why our pasuk comes to say, no, it doesn't. Okay, again, in order to have a pasuk excluding, it had to have been some sort of thought that it would be included. No, that doesn't work, because mal ben of sheken kavalo kli. But there's definitely a leniency in a ben of, which it doesn't even need a kli, a vessel for slaughtering. What does it mean, a vessel, not like a bowl? It means a knife. Remember, we talked about that knife is considered a sacred vessel also. It doesn't need a knife, because remember, the Kohen does it with his finger. So that already shows that the slaughtering is not as high level sanctity, or not as stringent as the animal, which means if it doesn't even need a knife, then why would you think it needs tzafon? So we don't need our pasuk to say a bird doesn't need to go in the north, it doesn't need to be slaughtered in the north, because why would you have even thought the bird needs to be slaughtered in the north? Moving on to our fourth. Elo tobet tzafon ve'ein pesach b'tzafon. Okay, this is done in the north. The korban pesach doesn't need to be slaughtered in the north. Now, before we get into the reasons and all that, I just want to have you imagine a little bit what would have happened if they did the pesach in the north. Okay, I'll remind you a little bit of some things we learned in Pesachim. If you remember, the korban pesach has to be done on the 14th in the afternoon. It has a very specific time to it. Not a lot of time to do it. Think about our Erev Pesach is busy, right? Their Erev Pesach was really busy. They had to have the entire community of the Jewish people slaughter an animal. Now, not everyone slaughtered, they were in groups, but still, how many people to a group, right? There had to be enough meat to go around for everyone in the group. So basically, they had a lot of people, and it was a big event. And what they would do is they did rotations. There were 3 rotations of people going in, because they all have to go inside the temple courtyard and slaughter the animal. Now, if we limited it to the north, it would be a major problem. So at least they don't limit it to the north, okay? But the question is why? Okay, they don't give the reason as well. It would be impossible to get the Korban Pesach done in time. That's not their reason, but I just wanted you to think about in the real world, if they had required it, it would have definitely complicated matters more, because you're limiting the amount of space that you could have all these people coming in, slaughtering animals, right? We need for the whole community, it would be quite challenging. But anyway, let's talk about this answer. So the Gemara simply answers, and that's why I said it's going to be a combination of both, because the first answer is, it's really one answer, but you'll see, Pesach mita Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov nafka. So they basically say, Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov learned it, and he learned it from somewhere else. Now, his method of learning it is going to basically, in the end, be, well, there's no reason to think it would be in the north. Okay? So that's why it's a bit of a combo, because we're saying we don't learn it from Oto because we learn it from somewhere else. Where's the somewhere else? Well, there's no reason to even think that it would require tzafon. So let's see what Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says. Yachol yehea pesach to'un tzafon. You might have thought it needs tzafon, and they're going to suggest why, just like they did with the ben of. We're going to bring a kavachomer. Vidinhu, din is usually a kavachomer, or it also just means logical, but often the logic is kavachomer logic. Uma ola shelo kaval azman b'shchitata. Now, an ola, a burnt offering, usually doesn't have a time frame where you have to slaughter it in a particular time. And yet, kavalat safon, but it does have a particular place, right? It doesn't have a time, has a specific place, only in the north. So Pesach, shekavalo zman, now Pesach that has a very specific time in which it can be brought, ein odin shekavalo safon, is it not, right? Wouldn't you think it would be obvious then, just like it has a set time, it would then have a set place of the north? To which they say, no, you wouldn't have thought that. This is Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov. He says, no, because mala olah shekein kalil. It's true that Pesach has a stringency, that it has a limit in terms of what specific time it has to be brought. But the olah is burnt completely, and the Pesach is eaten by people, right? That already means it's a much lighter offering. So they say, how about michata? Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov suggests, well, maybe we could learn from a sin offering that also doesn't have a specific time, isn't burnt completely, and yet has to be in the north. So maybe Pesach, which has a specific time, would have to be in the north. But again, malachatat, these are answers we've seen before in the past. Malachatat kemachaper l'chayvei klitot. But chatat has a severe law because it atones for very high-level sins, sins that have karet associated with it, punishable by karet. Those are the harshest of all. So it obviously is a stringent korban, and perhaps that's why it needs safon, and that wouldn't be relevant for the korban Pesach. How about me'asham, which doesn't have either of those? It's not burned completely. It doesn't atone for the high-level sins. Well, mala asham shekein kodshei kodshim. But asham is in the category, like we said before, of the higher-level sanctity offerings, that the meat gets eaten by the kohanim and not by anyone, right? Not by the owners, and the Pesach is eaten by the owners. It's in general a lighter level of severity, so it's called kodshim kalim, and that's why maybe it would need north. It wouldn't need north at all, and mikulu nami. Now, even if you try to learn it from the combination of the three, ola, chatat, and asham, still you could say shekein kodshei kodshim, but they're all three kodshei kodshim, and that's where Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says its Pesach doesn't need safon because there's no reason to think it would need safon. The only way to learn it would be from one of the kodshei kodshim, and they're all higher level severity for all different reasons, and all the more so because they're all kodshei kodshim, and Pesach is kodshim kalim, so there'd be no reason, so the oto can't be coming to exclude that because it's excluded for other reasons. Okay, so in the end, we tried 4 options. Nachshon, Seir Nachshon, Shachat, the Shochet has to stand in, right, doesn't have to stand in the north. Nachshon, Shachat, Of, B'tzafon, Of, B'Pesach, so Of, the bird, no, it's not that one, and Pesach, it's not that one. So now, where do we go? I told you already before that we're going to go back to the second answer and reinstate it. We go back to one of the ones we said earlier, the one about the person does not have to be in the north. The person who slaughters only the animal. Now, didn't we say, but we learned it from Yud Aleph, right? The beginning where we talked about the Ola, and it said Shachad Oto, and we said Oto, but not, right? It's different from the blood, the accepting the blood. The one who accepts the blood, it was obvious that he has to be in the north, but the Oto comes to say, in this case, though, only the animal, not that, but that's not our Oto, and then what are we going to do with that? Well, what do? They change Rabbi Achiya, and this is really rereading it completely different from what he said. They flip it like this. Do Rabbi Achiya, lav l'me'ute shochet b'tzafon u'da'at, that drasha in Aleph Yud Aleph, about the Ola doesn't come to exclude the shochet. What does it come to say? Elahachi kamar. He reads to say like this. Ein ha-shochet b'tzafon. Now, say like this. The shochet doesn't need to be in the north. That's what the Oto there comes. How do we know? Because of our Oto. In our Pasuk Dalet Kaf Dalet about the Seir of the Nasi, Oto comes to say Oto, but not the one who slaughters. Okay? Then they say, the other Pasuk, Aleph Yud Aleph, when it says V'shachat Oto a second time, even though that was the first time, but okay, but the second time comes to say, this one doesn't need to be in the north, Aval Mekabel Batzafon, but the one who accepts the blood does. So he flips it. Instead of saying, the one, remember I said before, we don't really know where we learn the Mekabel has to be in the north. So according to this reading, Rabbi Achiya's drasha is coming to say, once we get from our Pasuk, that only the animal needs to be in the north, but not the slaughterer, and then we have another Pasuk which says it again, that second time it's saying, this is the only place where it's needed, meaning in the, where you could do it. The slaughterer doesn't have to be, the person doesn't have to be in the north, it's in the slaughtering. But the Mekabel has to be in the north. And that's what that comes to. Now, there's one difficulty on this, which is Mekabel mi lakach. Okay, it should be lokach. Okay, this is a pasuk. V'lakach hakohen midam hachatah be'etzbo. The kohen takes from the blood in his finger. They say that's, and the lakach they say is the kabbalah, the accepting, and they darshan it as lokach. He takes himself. He has to specifically place himself in the north. So we shouldn't learn it from Aleph Yud Aleph that only the slaughterer doesn't need to be standing in the north, but the Mekabel does. If you learn it from this pasuk, to which they answer lakach lokach lo mashmale. That's Rasha, just the author of, okay, going back to the author of the Brighton, Daf Nun Hey, who basically said we had Oto, but we thought it was coming to this. It's not. What is it coming in the end, which they never really discussed? Well, they must have said it's coming for this, and they just didn't have the drasha of lo kach, and that really Oto is coming to say, again, in our pasuk, Oto is coming to say, Oto b'tzafon, and not the animal, but not the slaughterer. And then when we go to Rabbi Achiya, he doesn't have the lakach lo kach drasha, and therefore what he says is, he says basically the pasuk v'shachat oto and Aleph Yud Aleph is coming to say this law that we learned from Daled Kaf Daled of Oto and not the shochet is only specifically for the shochet, but not for the makabel. Okay, and someone else darshans it differently. It actually should be lo yikach. Himself he takes. Okay, and then we have two different ways of understanding that, but we basically resolved the difficulty of Rabbi Achiya because we reread him and said he really teaches the reverse of what we thought he was teaching. What he took is obvious, right? Now that's actually what he's learning. Okay, that ends that whole long tangent, which was a tangent on a tangent. Okay, now we're back to our topic. So you're liable for kneading, for all the actions that you do. If, as you're doing those actions, it leavens the bread more than the previous stage, right? You knead it, it leavens. You then set up the loaves, it leavens. You then bake it, it leavens more. You're chayav for all those stages. Amar Rav Papa, afa'a lokeshtaim, achar ala richata va'achar ala fiatana. We're going to go with Rashi here, even though there's some who understand this differently. He says, if you bake it, you actually are liable for the baking alone 2 sets of lashes. Why? Because baking involves the completing of the process of setting up the loaves, right? Setting up the loaves is shaping them. Well, when you bake them, it kind of finalizes the shape. So it's actually 2 actions in one. It's also shaping it and it's also baking it. Okay, so he says you're going to be chayav twice for the bread. So now they say, Vaha Amarit, how could you say that? On the Braita that we saw in yesterday's daf, it said, Ma'afiyah miyuchedet, shi ma'aseh yechidi, v'chayavin aleh b'fnei atzma. Right? They said, just like afiyah miyuchedet, that it's its own unique action and you're obligated on its own. Likewise for all the others. Well, that seems to indicate you're only liable 1, and it is its own unique action. It doesn't include 2 actions. So they say lo kashi. Now that's not difficult because had arachu va'afahu, had aracha reviyav leva'afa. There's 2 different scenarios. One is where you did the aricha and the afiyah. That's what the Braita was talking about. When it said you only chayav 1 for baking, it's when you yourself set up the loaves. Then you're already obligated for setting up the loaves. So when you bake it and you finish the setting up, you don't get 2 sets of lashes for the aricha, 1 for setting them up and 2 for finalizing the setup with the baking that kind of happened as you baked. But if, let's say, you set up the loaves and I baked it, then I would get 2 sets of lashes because when I baked it, I finalized the aricha that you did, and then I could get 2 sets of lashes. So that's the differentiation between Rav Papa. That's what Rav Papa's talking about. Whereas the Braita was talking about if I did all the actions, then each one would be an independent action, that I would only get lashes of 1 set of lashes for baking. Okay, now we're going to bring something completely different, but you're going to see how it relates to doing an action. Okay, this is, I'll set it up by talking about bishul achar bishul that we learned in Shabbat, because that's an easy way to get it. If I've already cooked something before Shabbat, and then I cook it again, right? We say generally ain bishul achar bishul. There's a big thing about water, though. Maybe there is bishul achar bishul, like if your water boils and then it stops boiling and you boil it again. That's like a new act of cooking. But if I cook the chicken and then I cook it again, I'm not, right? It already cooked, so my cooking didn't really do anything. Now, in this situation, we don't say that because if it leavened in the earlier process and then I did a later process and it leavened more, I am obligated on it. So now we're going to go to a completely different scenario, which is the laws of Bechor. Bechor is a firstborn animal. The firstborn animal, everyone's firstborn animals, they have to give to the Kohen. Now, the Kohen is supposed to sacrifice them. If it gets a blemish, the Kohen's allowed to just slaughter it and eat it by himself. There's always a concern. The Kohanim are going to, if the Kohen inflicts a blemish, you're not allowed to say, oh, now I can eat it, because otherwise all the Kohanim would just inflict blemishes. They wouldn't have to sacrifice them, right? And it says in the Torah, you can't inflict a blemish in an animal that's supposed to be brought on the altar. So there's a negative prohibition about that. So the question is, here we have an animal, a bechor. Okay, I'll start with the Braita. Tanu Chabanan. Bechor she'achazo dam. He has some blood problem. Okay, and presumably he's going to die if you don't do bloodletting. Now, bloodletting could theoretically cause a blemish. Depends on where you do it. So now we have a four-way machloket here. Really, two of the opinions are going to be what interests us, but we're going to learn all four anyway. Mikizino toat adam b'makom she'ein osim bo mum. Ve'mikizim et adam b'makom she'osim bo mum. You can't bloodlet, which, again, we have to open something, right? Like we take blood now, right? But they would bloodlet. I don't know exactly if it's the same way that we take blood, but basically they let out blood. You can't do it in a place, Rashi says, like, for example, on his ear or his eye, where he wouldn't be cured after that. Like, he would end up with a blemish. Okay, now it would save his life. The animal seems to be in life-threatening danger. So you're allowed to bloodlet this bechor, but do it in a way that you're not basically inflicting a blemish on the animal. That's Rabbi Meir. Chachamim omrim yakiz af b'makom she'osim bo mum. He says you can do it in a place where there's not a mum. Why? Because it's already a Baal mum. The animal has a blood problem. What's more Baal mum than that? So there's no problem to inflict a wound on an animal that's already blemished. Okay, or inflict a blemish. Okay, so basically, he has no problem where you do the bloodletting because the animal already is blemished. So the whole prohibition, this is where we get now. I want you to notice here, there's a machloket about this. Before we get to the other two opinions, there is a machloket. Now, he does add the side point, which is the Kohen can't go ahead and slaughter the animal, though, and say, oh, now there's a blemish. Why? Because then there's a gzeirah. They basically say if we allow that, maybe the Kohen's going to pretend, oh, my animal was about to die, I had to bloodlet, and it's not really true. There was always a concern that Kohanim were going to come up with ways, because the pain to bring your animal to the temple and only slaughter it there, you'd rather just slaughter it right now when you can. So, as long as you don't slaughter it, but there's no negative prohibition of don't inflict a wound. We're going to see soon where Rabbi Meir and the rabbis get their positions from in the psukim, but basically you have a machloket. Can you inflict a blemish on an already blemished animal? According to the rabbis, yes. According to Rabbi Meir, no. Now we have a machloket of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, which Rashi connects to their famous machloket in Masechet Shabbat about davar she'eino mitkaven. If you don't intend to do the action, but the action happens anyway. So Rabbi Shimon Omer, turning now to Amud Bet, af nishchat alo tomum. He says you can do the bloodletting on a blemish. Why? Because even if you know it's going to create a blemish, it doesn't matter. What's your intent in your action? Your action is, I want to bloodlet. You're not trying to inflict a blemish. If you were trying to inflict a blemish, that would be right, but that would be mitkaven. But you're not mitkaven to do that. Now, Tosfot has a problem with Rashi because what happened to psik, right? If you chop off the head of a rooster, it's not going to die. If you bloodlet in a place where it's going to cause a blemish, you're causing a blemish anyway. And even in psik, Rabbi Shimon would agree it's prohibited. There's a whole debate here about it, but Rashi just simply says this is davar she'eino mitkaven mutar according to Rabbi Shimon, and Rabbi Yehuda omer afilu meit em mikizin lo tadam. And Rabbi Yehuda says even if he's going to die, there's no way you could do it because he doesn't think that davar she'eino mitkaven is going to help you. The fact that you're not trying to inflict a blemish doesn't matter. In the end, that's what you're doing. And Rabbi Yehuda in general in Masechet Shabbat is strict about this also. And davar she'eino mitkaven, this machloka between them comes up in a lot of other places as well. Rabbi Shimon only cares about the results. Rabbi Yehuda only cares about the results. If in the end you did a blemish, we don't care what your intent was. And Rabbi Shimon's all about the intent. Okay, but there's super interesting machloket, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda. We've seen in other places. It's not the central focus here, so we're not going to focus on it for today. Now, so in this case, there's a machloket, but let's go back to the first two opinions. Are you allowed to inflict a wound, a blemish, if there was already a blemish? According to the rabbis, yes. According to the Rabbi Meir, no. However, Amar Rabbi Achiya bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Hakol Modim. So Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying they both agree, though, that in the case of mechametz achar mechametz shehu chayav, dichtiv lo te'aseh chametz v'lo te'afeh chametz. Because we have our unique drasha that we started in yesterday's daf, you can't make it chametz, and you also can't bake it chametz. Now, you're baking it after you already cause it to be chametz in the kneading process, right? Baking normally happens after it's kneaded, after it's already leavened. So here you see there's no exemption of, it already leavened, so you're not going to be obligated when you leaven it, when you bake it, because it already leavened, right? That's not the case because we have a special drasha. And likewise, in another case, so even the opinion, the rabbis who said there's no problem to inflict a wound on inflict a blemish on an already blemished animal, he wouldn't say the same thing by us. He would say it's a problem by us. And misares achar misares, castrating an animal is also forbidden. What if you castrate an animal that's already castrated? We'll see a case in another second. Shu chayav, you're going to be chayav. Why? Dichtiv says when it talks about you're not allowed to castrate animals, it says ma'uch v'chatut v'natuk v'karut. Now, they're going to focus on the words natuk and karut. So natuk is to completely sever, and karut is to cut, but not completely cut off. So im al koretu chayav al notek lo kol sheken. If you're chayav on koret, by cutting it without completely severing it, obviously you're going to be chayav on completely severing it, so why bother mentioning both? Ela lahavin notek achar koretu chayav. The whole reason is to say, if you sever it after you already cut it, but didn't completely sever it, and then you sever it, which already you castrated the animal in stage 1, you're still going to be obligated. So in both these cases, there's a drasha in the pasuk which makes it very clear that you're going to be obligated even for the second action. Lo nechleku ela b'matil ba'amum b'ba'amum. But the only machloket is, what if you inflict a blemish on an already blemished animal? And now we're going to see what the root of their debate is. Rabbi Meir Savar. Now they're going to both derive it from the same pasuk but different words in the pasuk. So I'll read you the whole pasuk. If you're going to bring a sacrifice of a shlamim as a neder, nidava, right, different types of voluntary offerings, whether it's bakar or tzon, whether it's cattle or sheep, tamim yihiyeh l'ratzon, it has to be completely whole, meaning not blemished. Kol mum lo yebo, there shouldn't be any mum in it. Okay, so now they say the following. So now they say, Lo nechleku ela b'matil ba'amum. Rabbi Meir Savar, kol mum lo yihiyebo. He says, kol mum lo yihiyebo. What does that mean? Any blemish, even if it's already blemished. V'Rabbanan Savre tamim yihiyeh l'ratzon. The rabbis say, what do you mean? It says tamim. It has to be completely whole. If you inflict a blemish, don't inflict a blemish on a complete animal. If the animal's not complete and it's already blemished, then this prohibition doesn't apply. So now we're going to have to see what does each one do with the other's pasuk, because both are in the pasuk, and how do they grapple with the other? So we'll start with Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir, nami haktiv tamim yeh l'ratzon. So what does Rabbi Meir do with the fact that it says complete, right? And it sounds like only a complete animal would be prohibited. Hahu l'mi'ute ba'amum me'ikara. That's coming to indicate that if the animal wasn't complete from birth, if it was born a blemished animal, it would be a problem. But, meaning you wouldn't be prohibited to inflict a wound on an animal that was blemished from when it was born. Only when you obligated, when you inflict a blemish on an animal that was blemished during its lifetime. Okay, and that's what the tamimi is coming for him to say, well, if it was born blemished, then you're right. There's no prohibition. But the Gemara says, Ba'amumi ikara dikla ba'almahu. An animal that was born with already blemished is like a tree, meaning it's not even a bechor. It doesn't have sanctity to it because it was already blemished from the moment it was born. As opposed to, right, so you don't need a pasuk to tell me, oh, well, on that kind of animal, you won't be obligated for inflicting a blemish because there's no reason. It's not anything. Fine, so let's try something else. What does he do with tamim yeh? Must be there's some other animal that you're not liable for inflicting a blemish. If you have animals that became disqualified for the altar, you redeem them, then you're not going to be liable if you inflicted a blemish on one of those animals, since it's already disqualified, so you're not inflicting a wound. Okay, well now the Gemara has to explain, like we did earlier in the daf, why do I need a drasha for that? Isn't it obvious? I mean, it's an animal that was sanctified, but was disqualified, and I now redeemed it, so what's left in it, right? Once you redeem it, you took off the sanctity, so of course I'm not going to be liable for inflicting a blemish. Well, no, because you might have thought, You have to say what you might have thought that you need a pasuk to tell you. Tamim yiyeh, this comes to exclude that weird case, or unique case. Sal kadat hachemina, you might have thought, ho'il va'asire begiza va'avoda bimuma nami litasre. You might have thought, now there is, it's not true. A psulei mukdashim, if I have an animal that was, once, remember, animals, when I sanctify them, they're kedushat haguf. That's very high level sanctity. Now you can't redeem them. When can you redeem them? Only if they're disqualified. So when they're disqualified, you can redeem them and take off the sanctity. But there's a little bit of sanctity that's always there. What is that sanctity? You can never shear that animal, and you can never use it to work in like a field as plowing or something like that. So you might have thought that since it still has that sanctity to it, b'muma nami litasre, maybe it's also forbidden to inflict a wound, a blemish. Kamash malan, that's what tamimi yeh. Only an animal that's tamim and not one that was disqualified and redeemed. There's no problem. And that's what Rabbi Meir does with the rabbi's pasuk. So now they say, v'rabbanan nami haktiv, kol mum lo yebo. Okay, what about the rabbis? They say, what do they do with the pasuk of Rabbi Meir? Kol mum lo yebo. They need it for the following drasha. What's the drasha? Kol mum lo yebo. It says in this part, "Komum lo yebo, ainli ela shelo yehebo mum, minayin shelo yigrom lo al yedei achirim." Okay, this is going to sound a little cruel. Okay, but how do you know that you can't cause it by others? Meaning, okay, I know I can't inflict a wound. Maybe I could do something indirect. What could I do? Shelo, but they're telling you you can't. That's what it means. Kol mum. Okay, Shelo, right? Rabbi Meir wanted to say kol mum even if after it was already blemished. The rabbi said no. It's coming to say I can't inflict a wound in any way, even indirect. Like what? Shelo yanech batsek od vela al gabei ozen kedei sheyavo hakelev yitlenu. How do I know that I can't put some dough on it or a fig on the ear? Okay, like a dried fig, something sweet, so that the kelev, knowing that a dog is going to come and bite it off, and then, right, this is why it sounds very cruel, knowing that, okay, so I'm not inflicting the wound myself, but I can get the animal to have a wound on it by doing that. Okay, it's likely it's going to happen. Talmud lomar kol mumam. Amar mum va'amar kol mum. Okay, that's why it says kol mum. Mum is I can't do it myself. Kol mum is I can't allow it to happen in any other way. And that's what the rabbis do with Rabbi Meir's pasuk. Okay, so in the end, we saw that they have this machloket about this pasuk. Right? How do we understand it? Which leads them to this machloket, but that machloket doesn't exist in our case because it says lo te'aseh and lo te'afeh, and it doesn't exist in Misares because it says natuk and karut, which there's no reason to say karut if it already says natuk, or right? It doesn't need to say natuk if it already says karut. So both cases they're teaching that there is an isur of Misares achar Misares, to castrate after being castrated and to put a blemish after it already has a blemish. To bake it leavened after it was already leavened, okay? But with the animal, there's a machloket, and that's based on how to read that different parts of that same pasuk. Okay, we'll finish with Rabbi Ami, even though this really starts the whole next sugya, although it's connected. Rabbi Ami, heniach se'or al gabe isa, v'halach v'yashavno v'nitchamtza me'eleha. Okay, what if I put the leavening agent on the dough, but I didn't need to do anything to it? And what's going to happen if I do that, right? It's going to leaven on its own. So how do I know chayav aleha? Chayav aleha k'ma'aseh Shabbat. Just like in Shabbat. Okay, what does it mean in Shabbat? So Rashi says, if I put basar al gabei gechalim b'Shabbat, v'nitzlem elav, right? What if I say, well, I just stuck it on the barbecue, but I didn't do anything, right? I didn't, right? So what? I'll say I'm exempt. Of course I'm chayav on Shabbat for that kind of thing. To which the Gemara says, "U'maaseh Shabbat ki agavtem mi'mechayev." Are you really chayav on Shabbat for this? Ha'amar Rabbi Bar Chana, and we'll continue tomorrow and see where Rabbi Bar Chana says that maybe you're not exactly chayav on Shabbat. So we'll have to come back to this and figure out what exactly they mean. So we did two main things today, other than that very last piece. But the two main things we did was figure out what that word oto really does come, because in the end, it didn't come to exclude other chataot in the tzafon, right? That need tzafon. All other chataot need tzafon. So what did the word oto actually be? And that was because of that third pasuk. What did oto come to exclude? We have four possibilities. In the end, we after we rejected all four, went back and reinstated number two by rereading some other drasha that seemed to say we don't need this one for that, but then we said, oh no, we flipped that one, and then it all worked. Then we got to this idea of being obligated on multiple actions of leavening even after it already leavened. And then we said that really comes from this pasuk, and the same thing with serus, and that's different than from
the issue of the Baal Moon, where we have machloket about the issue. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a Shavua Tov and B'sorot Tovot.